I'm hoping you can hear me. So thank you very much for joining with us this afternoon. My name's Heather Gray and I'm the Head of Physiotherapy and Paramedicine at Glasgow Caledonian University, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today. So this webinar is actually the third in our series of 4 professional development events, which are part of QAA Scotland's collaborative cluster on student mental wellbeing and the curriculum. This is a continuation of the successful cluster that we ran last year. This year we have a focus on our BAME and LGBTQ plus student learner communities. So today we're delighted to have not just 2 as per the previous webinars, but we have 3 inspiring speakers joining with us. So first of all, we're going to hear from Mel McKenna and Sara Turkington, who will be speaking to us regarding the mental wellbeing of trans and gender diverse students. And then we're going to hand over to Churnjeet Mahn from the University of Strathclyde, whose presentation will speak to racial equality in higher education and the curriculum. So we will have some opportunities for questions after each of their presentations. So please make use of the chat function during the presentations to post your questions. We'll collect them and pose them to the speakers. So also feel free to use the chat function to highlight any resources that you feel might help others. We can also add these to the resources that we're collating and posting on our Collaborative Cluster website. And finally, just for noting, we're going to be recording the session, which also records the chat, and we'll make the video available on the QAA Scotland Collaborative Cluster website after the webinar. And if anyone's using Twitter today, the hashtag is #ThemesWellbeing, all one. So please can I remind you to keep your mutes muted, cameras off during the session, and we'll just get started now. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over first of all to Sara. Thank you very much, Sara.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Just to, well, hopefully this is going to work, I should say. I'm not able to move my screen at the moment. Tech, if you just give me a moment. Sorry, everyone. I will now start. Hello, my name is Sara, and myself and Mel are here to speak about the mental wellbeing of trans and gender diverse students. As the co-chairs of the Trans Edu Community Practice for the sector, we wanted to bring a focus to the mental wellbeing of trans and gender diverse students in particular, to this particular webinar. I guess for us, it's worth saying that we are not experts by any means, but what we are 2 people who want to make a difference to the learning experiences of those that are trans and gender diverse. And that pretty much has been the approach that we've taken in terms of this presentation. So for us, what we want to do through the presentation is speak around the context, and in particular, what are the factors that may impact upon a trans and gender diverse student's experience? Because through knowing that, then we have the opportunity to positively impact upon that experience. So in effect, what I'm saying is we have to think about what our influence is and how we can change an experience through our engagement. In addition to that, we want to give an opportunity and some practical considerations. Once we've understood the factors that may contribute, or what are the ways then that we can change and affect that particular experience. So without further ado, I will go ahead and speak about that context. I should say though, the slides that I'm going to put up as part of my section of the presentation, some of which might seem a little bit unsettling, a little bit uncomfortable. So one of the slides does include words that I've taken from a student quote. And in that, what the student describes is an experience in which they were going to the university library. So I do want to say at this point, some of the words might trigger something within you, but all I'm trying to do is highlight and show that these experiences still exist for many LGBT plus students. And therefore, as I said, when we understand that, we can make and influence change. So again, if I look at the particular words on the screen here, as I've said, they describe a student's experience to the library. And for me, when I look at these words, I think about selfishly myself, in that these are words that I've had, very similar words that I've had said to me or shouted at me. But there are also words that I've feared and fear being said to me. And the reason that I'm bringing that into this discussion is because, again, I want to make the point of this is unacceptable, but somehow this reality has become acceptable. And perhaps we don't always pay enough attention to the significance of incidents such as these and how they affect learning. So again, if I even think about that internalization of these particular words, there's still stigma that can be created of being a gay person or being trans or gender diverse. And that therefore has the ability to compromise mental well-being. So that brings us right back in again, as educators working within this sector, how will we recognise these incidents for what they are, and how do we then change them? All of that brings into focus the reality. There might be issues here around safety. And before I move on to pass on to Mel, I guess we just have to again recognise that this is where we are at currently in terms of trans and gender diverse students in particular. We know, for example, that only 20% of trans students have told us that they feel safe on campus. Again, what does that then feel like? How do you internalise that? How do you then engage with learning and the curriculum when this is the reality? We also know, for example, that 36% of trans students have received negative
every thread of that all the time. Faded and thin onto the strip of raindrops.
And in addition to that, we know that 7%, for example, of LGBT students have received the same. Moreover, we know that 1 in 5 trans and gender diverse students have been encouraged and actively encouraged by those within universities to hide their trans identity. So again, that brings into play the reality of mental well-being, but how these things impact in terms of how someone therefore might engage, not only with their learning, but how they might engage with staff within a college or university. We also know from McKendry and Matson's piece of research within Scotland, which in effect led to the trans community of practice being initiated. They were able to tell us, for example, that 23% of students and staff felt entirely unable to speak to their institution about their trans identity or status. We also know from their particular research that 57% of trans students and staff, in terms of course withdrawal or extended absences, were all related to their mental health. Again, from their piece of research, we know that something like 86% of trans and gender diverse students had experienced barriers directly related to their gender identity. Now, again, for me, what that brings into focus, as I keep emphasising, and I do apologise, but it really, again, shows what is within our power to change. And all of these things around safety, inclusion, welcoming environments, even visibility, are within our control. So very much for us, I know that's been very quick in terms of a context and in terms of a reality, but what it does show is our ability to take actions. Now, as I said at the start, myself and Mel are the co-chairs of the Trans Edu Community of Practice, which is a practitioner-led forum. It's a forum for discussion with the clear aim of influencing change and informing practice so that we can be in a place that some of the statistics and context in which I've just shared begin to move and shift. From that community of practice, we have discussions around what those actions might look and feel like for trans and gender diverse people. And that's the next part of this presentation that Mel's going to take you through.
Hi everyone. Just going to share my screen with you now. Okay, sorry, more technical issues. This was running perfectly when we did our practice. 2 seconds. Here we go. Okay. So I'm just going to play from current slide. Yep, so hopefully people can see that okay. I'm just going to go back one. Thanks, Sara, for that. So I'm Mel. I work as a disability advisor at Glasgow Caledonian University. And like Sara said, I'm also the co-chair of the Trans Edu community of practice. So yeah, a lot of what Sara was saying makes for quite grim reading really. But what I wanted to talk about was how we can actually make learning spaces more welcoming and accessible for trans students. As a non-binary queer person myself, the education system is something I've moved through, you know, over the years from kind of learning into working in that environment. So I hope that I can bring, you know, some of my own personal experiences into that, but also working in student wellbeing. And, you know, talking with the students that I work with, hopefully I can also bring a bit of what they're kind of experiencing as well to the table. So yeah, what I thought I would do is focus on a few key areas that you'll see on the slide there that hopefully show how important an institution-wide approach is when we're considering how we can best support trans students and positively impact on their mental wellbeing. So I wanted to give this some context. So I've framed this discussion around some questions that just for you to have a think about while I'm talking, and then I'll give some kind of practical examples of how this might work in practice. I just think that can be quite a helpful approach. I've had to keep it fairly short, so these are just, you know, some examples of what you might be able to do. So if I could just move on. So yeah, the first thing I was thinking about was curriculum design. And really what I wanted to kind of get you to kind of think about is whether your teaching and learning materials represent, you know, a wide range of experiences, perspectives and identities. Specifically in this context, you know, are your materials gender diverse? You know, are they inclusive of trans students? And I should say that I'm using the term trans here really to cover anyone that doesn't fit within the kind of gender binary. So we could be talking about non-binary students, trans men, trans women, genderqueer. So I will use trans just for the sake of it being an inclusive kind of umbrella term. So yeah, in terms of curriculum design, it can be really hard to engage with materials that you don't really see yourself reflected in. I can think it can make it really difficult to relate to them. So just for example, you know, I studied primary teaching at uni, and I think one of the reasons that the course felt quite alienating to me was the lack of diversity in general. Now this was in the mid-2000s, so it wasn't a long time ago, but specifically the lack of visibility around LGBT and trans people. It really impacted on my experience quite a negative way, and I didn't have a very good time because I couldn't be myself and I didn't see myself reflected in, you know, the learning materials. So yeah, for trans students, this can really contribute to the feeling of being othered. It can negatively impact, obviously, you know, on your sense of worth and belonging if you can't see yourself related in those materials. And just to give a kind of a very basic example of what you might be able to do to be a little bit more inclusive in your practice. So this is something that Obviously working at GCU, there's a very large kind of nursing school, and I work a lot with nursing colleagues on looking at developing their inclusive kind of approach. So things like including diverse families, you know, that represent the students you teach and the community that you're in, you know, rather than always kind of defaulting to just, for example, Mr. and Mrs., including more diverse families when you're looking at case studies, when you're discussing patients, things like that. That will really help students to relate to the materials, and that will help them to feel valued as well when they're in that kind of context. So I wanted to kind of move on to the next key area that I was thinking about, which was the hidden curriculum. So before I get on to talk about this, I'll just read this quick definition of what the hidden curriculum actually means, just in case anyone isn't familiar with it. So a hidden curriculum refers to the unspoken or implicit values, behaviours, procedures and norms that exist in the educational setting. While such experiences are not explicitly written, hidden curriculum is the unstated promotion and enforcement of certain behavioural patterns, professional standards and social beliefs while navigating a learning environment. So basically everything that's kind of unsaid in the kind of learning spaces, we would kind of deem that as the hidden curriculum. So how can you make learning spaces welcoming and engaging for trans students? You'll often see in some of the discussions about inclusion and making people feel, you know, welcome, the bar is quite low. So we're really looking to get beyond that and actually think about how we can actually make people included and not just the very base of, you know, feeling safe. So yeah, learning spaces can often, you know, reproduce kind of binary cisgender norms. Quite often there's still assumptions about what people's gender might be. Still quite a lot of reinforcing gender stereotypes as well. And quite a lot of the time it's unconscious, but it can lead to erasure for some groups of people. And it can make it really difficult for trans students to feel like part of that learning community. In some instances, it can even create quite a hostile environment. Just going back to some of the stats that Sara was talking about, in which trans students actually feel quite unsafe, can have quite a significant impact on their mental well-being. And obviously that can then lead to dropping kind of retention, kind of high withdrawal rates as well. So some examples, just keeping an eye on my time, so I'll speed it up here. Considering your use of language. So again, for me, if it was, you know, welcome everyone rather than welcome ladies and gentlemen, as a non-binary person, I would feel much more included in that. And it's just everyday phrases that you're kind of used to saying, but if you kind of stop and just think a little bit about it, there's things that we can do that can just make that environment a lot more inclusive for more people. So yeah, not making assumptions about what people's gender might be. Use pronouns where you can, if you feel comfortable using and sharing your pronoun. That can be quite helpful as well. And again, just avoiding gender stereotypes. Another one would be, you know, creating groups based on gender. As a non-binary person, I don't really fit neatly into the male or female category. So this is quite a stressful situation for me to be faced with, you know, if that were to happen to me in the classroom. And yeah, again, just kind of challenging transphobia. I would hope that would happen in the same way that you would want to challenge homophobia and racism, and having the structures and systems in place to kind of support you to do that. But if it's left unchallenged, you know, it can kind of imply that that's okay, and then that sort of perpetuates these kind of hidden kind of behaviours and values that kind of happen in the classroom. So I'll move on to the physical and virtual spaces, which is a huge area. For this presentation, I'll focus on online spaces just because of how relevant it is for all of us at the moment. And it's something we've been talking a lot about in the TransEdu community of practice. So have you considered the needs of trans students in an online context? You know, studying from home for some trans students, not all, it might be very difficult. They might not be out at home, or they potentially could live in quite an unsafe environment. So this can impact on how you interact with others online, how you engage with your learning materials. Some trans students might find using the camera or mic quite challenging. There could be a lot of anxiety around their gender presentation, or the sound of their voice, or seeing themselves on the screen as well. They might not be able to present as themselves in the same way if they were outside or on campus. So that can be quite upsetting, and it can be quite detrimental as well to your mental health. So some examples, and I know we're limited in the institution that we work in, the kind of platforms that we use, but it's just something to be mindful of. Be mindful of the learning environment that a student might be in. Offer a range of participation options, so if students can use the mic or their video or the chat function, it just gives people the opportunity to make use of what they're comfortable with. Consider platforms that enable students to take control of their name on the screen. Again, they might use a different name at home and a different name, when they're at university or college. And consider introducing pronouns on screen as well. So we know that Zoom is really good for changing your name. You can add your pronouns. This can change every time you go online. Other platforms aren't so good, such as Teams. So again, I appreciate that you're maybe limited there, but it's just something to keep in mind. And another thing, just a really quick note about pronouns. If you can share them, please do. You shouldn't feel forced to share your pronouns. Not everyone can or knows what their pronouns are. So it's just something to keep in mind, that people may or may not share them, but if you can, it can be quite a nice thing for people to see. It can make you feel like you might want to share yours, and it can avoid you kind of being misgendered. So I'll go on quickly, just to have a quick look at admin processes. So yeah, just thinking about, does your institution have clear processes in place for trans students who might need support? Can be quite clunky, the systems, if a student wants to change their name, or if they just want any additional support, if they were looking at taking time out, or if they had any kind of medical needs or anything like that, that can create quite a lot of stress, and having to kind of come out to multiple people is really tiring. So having a named contact, just move on, that can be a really, really helpful thing. So at GCU, we've got a named contact that sits within Student Wellbeing, that can be really helpful to just go to one person that can then facilitate everything for you. And it can take a bit of pressure off as well, that you just, you can have that one person and they can kind of, update your name on the systems and things for you. That can make quite a bit of difference. And I'll go on to my last slide because I know I'm quite short for time here. So yeah, again, it's student support, but just thinking about, is there an institution-wide approach to supporting trans students? So although I've just said having a named contact for trans students is really beneficial, it's important to ensure that all staff can engage with and develop their knowledge and understanding of trans lives and experiences. So everyday interactions can have a really significant impact on your mental health. It can actually really be the difference between a positive or quite a harmful experience. And again, student wellbeing and other support services should be accessible to trans students in the same way that the wider environment should be. And some examples of this would be show visible support. So it has to be more than that. It can't just be, we'll fly the trans flag once a year and that's us being, a good ally. But if you're doing these other things in addition to showing visible support, that can be really powerful. Providing training and development opportunities as well for all staff. Again, not just, student wellbeing, for example. It has to be kind of an institution-wide approach. Trans students are using many spaces. Listen to trans students and build their trust, develop positive relationships, and make use of external LGBT organisations as well who can offer support and advice. I was actually going to show a video, but I think we're a wee bit tight on time, so these slides will be available afterwards. It was just a quick 2-minute video that was created as a result of the Trans Edu research findings, and it was just some students talking about their experiences of being misgendered. But what I think I'll do is just move on so that I'm not eating into the time of the next presenter. So just to kind of summarise really, like Sara says, there's a lot that we can do, and it's not things that we would expect to be implemented immediately. These things take time, they take a bit of work, but there are some practical things, and I hope that you've taken from this presentation that there's some things that you can do just now that will make trans students feel more included, and that will actually have a positive impact on their mental health. We hear so much about the kind of negative impact, so I wanted to sort of turn it on its head a bit and talk about how we can actually positively impact on trans and gender diverse students. And these kind of things listed would be a great starting point. And yeah, just finally to say, stay in touch. If you want to join the TransEdu community of practice, we would love to have you on board. Again, you'll have access to this email address and things as well, so please do get in touch with us. I'm happy to chat with anyone as well after this if you want to drop me an email directly. But I will stop sharing my screen there and I will pass it back over to Heather.
Thank you very much, both of you. That's great. There's loads of information there, lots for us to think about. And I've just got a couple of questions I think we can fit in before our next speaker, if that's okay. So you mentioned certainly, and it obviously is important that we have institution-wide policies. And I know you mentioned lots of top tips as you went through there, but what would you suggest for individual module leaders or teaching staff who are kind of like wanting to kind of, get started and be better aware than perhaps they were before? What are some of the key starting points, would you say?
Neither of us are wanting to go first. I also just want to apologise. I see that sometimes my sound wasn't very good earlier, so I do apologise around that. Well, my response to that particular question would be that my feeling at this point would be thinking about your individual actions. However, they do need to fit in within a whole college or whole institution or university approach, irrespective, because that would send out the clearer message of what your institution stands for and believes in. Individually though, and I admit this is probably a selfish plug, but individually you might want to join something like the TransEdu community of practice, and that might be the starter to broadening your knowledge, broadening your understanding. But also, as I was saying earlier, whilst we aren't experts, what we are is essentially individuals and groups of people who want to make a difference. So even just the opportunity to share where people are at, whether that be some of the examples that Mel has shared, that you might take as an individual, pronouns and so on, but also how does that look then within a curriculum context? So again, a community of practice like ours is a good one for just talking about what does that look like if you wanted to embed it within a subject. Would be my sense and my perspective on things. I'm not sure, Mel, if you had further thoughts around that.
Yeah, no, I think that's what I was thinking as well. And just thinking about training and things as well. And I suppose, just thinking about department-wide approaches. Everyone's going to have varying levels of knowledge and understanding, and sort of, so we have kind of delivered at GCU some tailored kind of trans awareness sessions as well for specific departments. So that can be really contextualized to what your particular course is as well. So although I'm saying it should be institution-wide, there are pockets of kind of, I don't want to say expertise, but maybe kind of more experience. So we can definitely input into that. And as Sarah said, the TransEdu community is a great place for sharing across FE and HE, because there's so many different things going on. It can be hard to keep track sometimes. But yeah, that would be what I would say as well. Yeah, no, the TransEdu site has definitely got some great materials on it. Just one last question, Mel, I'll put this to you. So what are the main factors that make trans students feel unsafe? What would you say the main things are? I think going back to that kind of hostile environment, and that's kind of spoken about quite a lot, and it can be quite hard to identify exactly what that is that creates that, because sometimes there's nothing that's very explicit, although there can be very explicit things as well. So I'll give a kind of concrete example. Actually happened at GCU just last year. Someone had scored out all the T on LGBT mental health support posters that were in the toilets. So for me to go in and see that as a non-binary person, that was quite upsetting, and immediately you feel unsafe because you think, I don't know who that was. That could be one person. It could be a group of people. It could be, you just think, is that the attitude that's sort of flowing through the university? So I suppose that's a much more explicit, thankfully not too common occurrence, but it is something that happens. I think just things like jokes, people making jokes that they don't think they're very harmful, but actually someone in the class might take that really personally, or things like, assuming there aren't any trans people in the class, or making assumptions about what a trans person might look like, and kind of, it can just make you feel quite unsafe, and it can take people a long time to figure out who is a safe person to come out to. So if you could make yourself find ways to kind of be approachable, and I know that's quite a difficult thing, that's quite a loaded thing, but I think that's the main thing is the fear of the unknown. And because of everything that's happening right now in the media, I think that's been ramped up quite a lot recently, and I think people are very kind of fearful, and rightly so, because again, you know, until it's like anything, until you kind of know someone, it's hard to know who you can kind of trust. So I think increasing awareness would really help with that as well. I'll stop.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, absolutely, totally agree. Okay, thank you very much, Sara and Mel. We've kind of run out of time just now. We need to move on to our next speaker, but thank you so much. And definitely I can recommend to people to dip into the TransEdu website and resources, because they are really excellent. So if it's okay, then we'll move on to Churnjeet, who is going to be speaking about racial equality in higher education and the curriculum, and she's just going to share her presentation with us. So I'll hand over to you, Churnjeet, just whenever you're ready, and thank you very much for joining with us this afternoon. We can see your slides, but you're still muted just now. Thank you.
Right, hopefully that's working. Sorry, I seem to be living opposite a building site, so things might get noisy. So I'm Churnjeet Mahn. Thanks for coming along. I'm a reader in English literature at University of Strathclyde. I'm currently deputy head of the School of Humanities, and I'm one of the AHRC EDI leadership fellows. I'm working on a project to do with race and heritage with one of my amazing colleagues, Dr. Ali Kaskar at University of Stirling. So today I'm going to talk about some of the labour and work of decolonisation in universities. And I suppose I want to begin on a positive note, because a lot of what I'm about to say or talk about for the next 20 minutes is going to be fairly critical. I think it's important to say I absolutely love universities. I am inspired by them. Universities changed my life. The classroom changed my life. At its best, it is a place where we can ask critical questions about the world, and we can equip our students with a vocabulary for unpicking the world around them and making it into a better place. And I know that will sound naive and idealistic to some of you, but I really, really believe that. And a really important part of my day job is teaching. So this is the kind of stuff I teach. So Cormac McCarthy, The Road, to think about the ways in which we're destroying our environment. Jean Rees, White Sargasso Sea, to think about the imbricated ways in which we're involved in the Caribbean and across the world. One of my personal favourites, Shirley Jackson, Haunting of Hill House, Psychological Realism in a Supernatural Collide. Jan Morris, Conundrum, an amazing memoir of trans experience, which has lots of cultural complexity in it. So our curriculum is already something that draws on all sorts of different types of experience. And this is work that belongs in a university, and it belongs in discussion. And you know what, it's been going on for a really long time. So one of the things that I want to think about is the work that's already out there. I would point to people like Sara Ahmed on Being Included, which I think was published in 2012, which is an amazing account of her doing the work of racial equality in a university, everything from thinking about diversity in the curriculum to diversity and representation. The Roads Must Fall Collective have written a brilliant collection. There's Gurminder Bambra's book that she's edited with others on decolonising the university. There are a huge number of resources out there already. So I hope that, I know some of this will be familiar to a lot of you, but I just want to emphasise the number of accessible resources out there. Some of these are free that you can read and access. But here right now, I want to pause because for me, here's the most important question. People have been talking about this and doing this kind of work, decolonising the curriculum in the UK for decades. I read about decolonising the curriculum as an undergraduate 20 years ago. So for me, some of this work is not about agreeing or nodding when someone says we need to diversify our reading list. That's obvious. But beyond this, I wonder about the ever-evolving institutional and cultural strategies to maintain the status quo, to make sure things don't change or that change is stalled. So I know in the little Eventbrite blurb about me, it says that I'm an expert in decolonising the curriculum. I am not an expert in decolonising the curriculum. If I could possibly do that, I would be sharing that knowledge with everyone, and so many issues to do with structural inequality would end. Part of what I want to do right now is kind of be critical of that account of decolonisation and what it holds for us in terms of meaning. Here's a really famous quote from Tuck and Yang, which gets used quite a lot. And again, some of the books that appear in the previous slide to talk about it. I would encourage you to have a wee look. If you're talking about decolonising anything in the university and you want that word to hold meaning, then I think it's important to do some of the work of understanding how Black, Indigenous and other people of colour have used that word. So decolonise, a verb in decolonisation, a noun, cannot easily be grafted onto pre-existing discourses frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. The easy absorption, adoption and transposing of decolonisation is yet another form of settler appropriation. The work of decolonisation is an endless process which is about unthinking and undoing the work of colonisation and empire, which in itself is a kind of impossible task and an impossible ask. So what are we actually talking about? What we're often talking about is taking institutions and disciplines which centre the experience of a world through knowledge produced by white people, which historically has used Black and minority ethnic people as case studies or objects of research, and recognising that this isn't the single perspective from which the entire world is seen and experienced. And something that I often tell my students, and is a wild statement of the obvious, most of the world is not white. So it is kind of amazing when we look at our reading lists and we look at what we're studying, and the vast majority of it is written by, produced by people who are white and circulated in the global north. There's all this knowledge that is missing, not recognised, not valued. So for me, part of this is just like, how can we know better, right? If we're lucky and we're doing some of this kind of work in universities, what I often see is some of our reading lists might include a few items that are by people who are not white. I mean, that's often a great outcome. I think in some of our subjects and some of parts of the sector, even getting to that stage is pretty difficult. So I want to think about the barriers to that. You know, why is that happening? Why is it that as an undergraduate 20 years ago, I read about decolonising the curriculum, and 20 years later, we're still having this conversation, and that for so many people, this conversation is so new. I think part of it is about competing narratives about diversity. So there are some types of social justice work that have better optics for institutions. So you'll find that work on race can come in and out of focus for institutions as a priority. So part of what we need to think about is longevity and sustainability of change, rather than it being often standalone small initiatives which can often fall apart when key members of staff move away or funding for something comes to an end. Policy-driven diversity implementation often produces diversity silos, although intersectionality will always get a reference. I'm sure, like me, many of you have intersectionality overload. It's a term that we see all the time, but I think one of the things that I'm worried about is it's often hollowed out of meaning. So we talk about, say, how race and gender or race and sexuality intersect in some way, but then it kind of gets left alone. So there is, in terms of a way policy is delivered in universities, an attempt to create these silos which work in parallel with each other and often don't think together and produce processes together. So think about when and why an axis of difference is highlighted. Now, I know it's messy when you talk about something like intersectionality and you're thinking about race and gender, but I think what is interesting, especially when we are being critical of, say, accounts of work about race in universities which can assume heteronormativity, or work about queerness which assumes whiteness, is that we have to ask when some difference about identity becomes important, and why and how a group of people across things like class and gender are connected by that in that moment. That's hard and it's messy, and that's why we often end up with something I'm just going to glibly call like photo bank diversity and corporate diversity. I'm sure, like me, you've come across a huge amount of clip art and photo bank art recently, which has these, and this is the one I picked up from Universities UK, these amazing diverse classrooms. And I keep asking myself, where are these classrooms? I've seen some of these classrooms. I've not seen that many of these classrooms. So there is a kind of disconnect, a profound disconnect, I think, between the image that universities and we project out and the material experience people are having in the classroom and in everyday life. So part of this work is about getting messy, right? How do we move from silos of diversity work to connected forms of social justice that is messier and harder? It's challenging. And let me give you one example, because I think sometimes this stuff is easier to evidence through anecdotes. International students. When international students arrive on our campuses, do some of them, say for example, we have a South Asian international student, will their experience of racism be identical to, say, my experience of racism? And I think in a lot of a way in which diversity work operates in a university, the answer to that is yes. But it's profoundly different because, as you might be able to detect from my accent, I'm Scottish. I was born and brought up in Glasgow. So I have decades of experience of the lived reality of racism in Scotland. But if you grew up in Delhi, where you're not subject to that kind of racism, and you arrive here, your experience is profoundly different. But I think it's just an example of the way in which sometimes a clunky understanding of race as an issue in our universities can produce unhelpful connections and parallels which raise more difficult questions that we have to ask. And then the final point about this competing diversities is how people move from being invisible to hypervisible. So I've been working on race and sexuality for 20 years now, and I cannot begin to tell you the number of times I've been asked in the past year to speak about race, not about sexuality. And I think it's difficult because you go from the thing you work on and the thing you think about and feel every day from being something that isn't worth being recognized to then having to do the labor of explaining it and talking about it non-stop, only to know, if you've been around long enough, that that work will be forgotten that the diversity narrative will move on, and then we'll be in a different cycle. And I think that's why I'm interested in how our curricula and organisations move from doing diversity work to then forgetting some of that diversity work. For the rest of the talk, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the common things that come up when you do the work of quote unquote decolonising the curriculum or making the university environment more diverse. One thing I keep coming across, especially in the arts and the humanities where I'm based, is that we don't have diverse students. So there's an assumption around the student body only being white, which begins the process of creating and delivering a white-centred curriculum where the experience and history of most of the world is marginal. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I see it in my undergraduates. When I look around a lecture theatre in level 1, I can see diversity, but by 4th year, that room is less diverse. Are we creating hospitable environments for students to stay in? Again, one of the things I often hear is that students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds want to do pharmacy and chemistry rather than subjects like English and history. There may be complex reasons for types of trends in picking subjects, but I think we need to flip the question and think, are we creating subjects that people from those backgrounds even want to study, that are inclusive enough for them to be in the room? The other thing that I often come up against, and I wonder if you do as well, is that these issues to do with race only apply to certain subjects. I mean, I couldn't disagree more. We need to equip all of our students, all of them, not just our Black and minority ethnic students, with a critical vocabulary to name, explain, and understand the world around them. This extends to all disciplines and all services. And I've just put some books here from disciplines very far away from mine, which are about computing and which are about science and which are about health, which thinks about the way in which race fundamentally impacts the design of most of our experiences in our day-to-day realities. So actually, when we encounter the I do an objective subject, you know, like race doesn't come into it, I think that's often about finding a strategy to not have to do the work of addressing histories of race and racism. Social vocabularies of racism versus lived experiences of racism. I suppose I just want to flag that when we start doing this work of decolonising the curriculum, there can be this accelerated change, which I think doesn't necessarily take account of the emotional labour it takes for students in the classroom and staff. So in the past few years, Black Lives Matter, Black and minority ethnic deaths during the pandemic, the SOUL report. I have found, and I'm sure my students have found, that we've been called to be different kinds of experts all the time. I cannot begin to tell you the number of unsolicited conversations I've had about statues and what my opinion is and what I think is a problem with Black lives. I mean, these are completely uninvited conversations. And I think having to do the work of embodying the fears other people have about these issues combined with having to live through them means that when you're entering into the classroom and you're doing some of this work, it does take an emotional toll. So what kind of space and support are we providing for those students? And when we don't have staff and we don't have professional services that have expertise in lived racism, you're often having students having to perform the labour of explaining what racism is in the environment they're in. And that's difficult. It's difficult because in that situation, there is a power differential and there's the kind of having to explain a structural system which everyone else in the room then attaches to you. And we don't necessarily ask that of our other students. And then what I often think happens after that is that there can be a silencing, because either people don't know what terminology to use or how to react to very difficult accounts that might be expressed. And I think that lack of confidence and that hesitation can be really challenging, because some people experience it as gaslighting, like, did what I say not happen? Like, is it not worthy of a reaction? And then sometimes that silencing can be felt as that wasn't an appropriate topic to talk about and is actually something you should not bring into the classroom. And then they're stepping outside of a classroom. So there have been situations in a classroom where, say, for example, we've talked about racism, but I worry about what happens to those students and me the minute we walk out of that room, with online bullying, with different experiences of social media. Like, how are we supporting students who might experience racism outside of a classroom, where conversations and topics from a classroom are stretched into other media? Who does this labor? I mean, at the moment, a lot of the work of talking about race and doing anti-racist work in universities falls to, for example, Black and minority ethnic women. I say that because, you know, that there's research that shows that women do a disproportionate amount of pastoral care in universities. So when it comes to this kind of pastoral care, we shouldn't be surprised that it's Black and minority ethnic women who are picking it up. Students are often tasked up with being experts. Now, I think it's interesting, I was listening to the first webinar in the series, and there was a great point about co-producing curricula with students. And I think it's a great point, but I also thought, are those students being paid? Or are they being tasked up with diversity work, which then the university gets to use and say, didn't we do a great job? And what happens when staff and students call out racism? I think they're held to very high evidentiary standards, because when you call out something that can be personally related to you and your identity, it's always seen as subjective. It's never, and because there are fewer people who have a shared experience where they can recognize it, it becomes something which is very difficult to name. And again, there are lots of times I've sent out those emails, I'm sure many people here have, where we say, you know, if you experience racism, call it out. I would ask you to reflect how many of you would put in a complaint about your line manager or someone with direct power over you. I'm sure many of you wouldn't, and our students are in exactly that position. There is lots of work about complaint and what happens when especially staff and students think about social justice work, which is based in race in universities. And I would point you to the work of Sara here, and just quickly say that if you're doing this kind of work, you will experience resistance from staff and students. For example, I have been told by staff and by students that I am marginalising the experience of white people and that race is being shoved down their throats. I've been told I have a problem with whiteness and white people. And that's not to say I've not also had more comments thanking me for bringing in diverse voices. But I can tell you that when it comes to evaluating student feedback, it's the fear of offending white students which becomes the most important voice, because I'm seen as potentially a biased person that is having a negative impact on students. It's exhausting work and it's frustrating work. As I've said before, it's messy, it is uneven, you will experience resistance. So how do we think about creating proper resources and support for people? And it requires fostering networks between people where you can have safe, critical debates. So just to conclude, who pays for the labour of racial equality in higher education? Black and minority ethnic people pay for it through everyday racism, being tasked to perform diversity, and through the lack of progression. I mean, we have plenty of information about the different kinds of attainment gaps and staff progression. Do universities pay for it? Are we hiring Black and minority ethnic staff in professional services and in academic and teaching positions? And if we don't, do we care? And if we care, what are we doing to evidence it and change it? And are we sure we're challenging cultures, or are we creating silos that excuse structural change? Are the usual suspects doing the good work? And at my most cynical, I would say that the usual suspects are doing the good work. But are the usual suspects getting enough support? What happens when the usual suspects move on? I want to leave time for questions. So I'm just going to leave this. Well, I think the slides will be circulated so you can have a look at this later. But I have made some practical suggestions about things that people can do. Most of it is about noticing, because I think noticing, naming and identifying problems is a first step in understanding how whiteness is centered in our institutions. And it's not a surprise. And then thinking about how we support people when they undertake this work, because it does require additional emotional labor, which has consequences for all. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Churnjeet. Yeah, the time is always racing against us, isn't it? I think I've just got time for one question really to put to you just now, but as you said, the slides will be available on our website afterwards. I'm just interested in the fact you were saying that, you know, your number of invites to speak over the last year in particular has risen exponentially, and obviously this shows a need that people feel they have for information, training, advice. So I'm interested as to what type of advice or information is it that they're looking for in particular, do you think?
I think there's a lot of hesitation and worry about terminology, and I totally understand that. However, I would say that there's such a plethora of resources out there, and it's okay to get things wrong. I get things wrong all the time. I'm a student, I learn from other people. And being vulnerable and being okay about being wrong and listening is part of the stage of learning. And I think that is more powerful and is a powerful act of solidarity in any kind of social justice movement, rather than saying, I don't understand it, it's too hard for me, or I'm going to leave it.
Yeah, and you were talking earlier about noticing, naming and identifying problems. And I think these are, you know, good things for people to bear in mind. And I think that relates to our first speakers as well. Anyway, I'm just totally aware of time. We never have enough time in these sessions. We're always trying to cram too much in. So I would just like to say a massive thank you to yourself, Churnjeet, also to Sara and Mel for coming and speaking to us today, for providing lots of very informative, thought-provoking information and presentations, lots of points for us to consider and resources to go and look up as well. Thanks everyone for joining with us today. And as mentioned, the recording of this session will be made available on the Collaborative Cluster website. Please feel free to circulate that amongst your networks as you see fit. And we have one more webinar that will be coming up in our series in June. And that's all for us just now, but you know, feel free to get in contact with either myself or any of the rest of the project team as well. Thank you very much. Bye just now.